Thank you all for coming to the first installment of the Francis Humphrey Lecture Series of 2019. And thank you all for supporting the museum. More than 90% of you are members today. Tonight we're here to talk about John Mackey, of course. And I'd like to introduce the author, Gregory Crouch. He graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1988. Where he was studying military history. He completed his U.S. Army Airborne and Ranger schools and led 2 infantry platoons. And then when he left the Army to pursue other interests, he decided to become an adventurer. And he did adventure travel, rock and ice climbing, and high-stakes international mountaineering. I could never, I did some rock climbing, but only when my dad was there holding the rope, So he developed a particular obsession with the storm-swept peaks of Patagonia and had 7 expeditions to those remote mountains where he made a number of world-class first ascents. And along the way, he became a writer. Crouch's entire career has been built from following his intellectual and adventurous interests to their absolute conclusion. And now he is the author who specializes in adventurous and historic subjects, most notably, of course, right now, Bonanza King, John Mackey and the battle over the greatest riches in the American West. But he's also written a true life World War II flying adventure, China's Wings, and a mountaineering memoir, Enduring Patagonia. And in his spare time, he reviews other authors and writes articles for other newspapers and magazines around the country. So I would like to help me welcome Gregory Crouch to the Nevada State Museum. And you're welcome to walk around.
It'll be fine, I'm sure.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much to the museum for having me out here, and thanks to you all for coming. I really appreciate it. Bob Nyland, is he here tonight by any chance? He was very helpful to me when I was researching this book, so your support of the museum, even indirectly, has helped me, so appreciate that. A question that was asked me just before we got started here was, how did I get interested in John Mackey in Virginia City? And that comes out of the previous book, China's Wings, which is a World War II flying adventure, which Johnny Saylor here in the audience has a personal connection to that story, which is very insane. But all of that story, or most of that story, was fascinating. I got to meet all the people, the research was great. This big flying adventure during World War II in Asia and India, or in China and India, totally fascinating project with one crucifying problem. Every time I wanted to visit a location, it was on the far side of the Pacific. So I could only really afford to go once, and I spent a month over there, but it would have been helpful to be able to go later in the process and make sure that I was getting the flavor of everything right. So when that was all done and gone and I needed a new story, I'm like, all right, there's got to be something interesting closer to home. So I was ferreting around in the early history of San Francisco, since I live in the Bay Area, and I kept running across all these connections to the old Comstock lode in San Francisco's early history, and that piqued my interest, and I started looking into it. And my mom had taken me to Virginia City in the 70s when I was a little boy, and I had a real good memory of like the gunfight on C Street and stuff. And then I read everything that I could about the Comstock lode. That's kind of the first order of business if you're going to decide to write a book on something. And it seemed to me that there's been a lot written about it through the years, that most of what had been written was either on the academic side and not so, maybe a little bit arid, or very sensational. The writers had kind of fallen in love with the whiskey and the gun smoke and the hooker with the heart of gold story. And that strikes me as not all that true. So I thought there was kind of a wide channel down the middle to drive through. And so that's, once I sort of established that, then I set off on this big John Mackey and Comstock lode. Well, the next thing you need after you have a milieu, or after you have an idea, okay, I think I could do something on the Comstock lode, then to write a piece of narrative nonfiction, a story, you need a main character. And if you're doing the Comstock Lode, that search is going to lead you pretty quickly to John Mackey. You know, he's the seminal figure in the history of the Comstock Lode. Walked onto the lode a few weeks after its first discovery without a nickel to his name, and then, you know, within 12 or 15 years, he'd become one of the richest people in the world. Certainly one of the richest people in the world, and almost certainly the man with the largest monthly cash flow. You know, his story is quite fascinating, and he's not that well known outside of Nevada, or even outside of northern Nevada. I'm very surprised at what little statewide penetration he has if you're giving a talk in Las Vegas, for example. But you know, he's for sure the seminal figure in 19th century Nevada. He was an incredibly influential figure politically. Republican presidential candidates all did their homage to John Mackey because he could deliver a state. You know, that's an important thing in presidential politics. And he was repeatedly asked to be senator, to stand for senator from Nevada, and he'd have probably run unopposed if he'd have declared. But you know, the famous saying from him, or the quote you read over and over in the newspapers, "I am not fool enough to go into politics." Anyway, I think the irony of him not being remembered is largely due to him being quite a good guy. It's almost impossible to find bad press about John Mackey after about 1880. In the 1880s, when he took on the Jay Gould telegraph monopoly and broke that, you know, people were amazed nationwide. He'd done a huge service breaking this monopoly, bringing rates down. And like I said, it's almost impossible to find bad press about him at the same time that the newspapers are going after, you know, his financial peers, guys like Huntington and Stanford and Rockefeller and Carnegie and Jay Gould. You know, these people are totally reviled, but Mackey just not. And late in life, those guys all knew they had a PR problem, a huge PR problem, so they found universities and philanthropic organizations in their names that have literally spent the last 100 years rehabilitating their family names. And it worked. That's the people that we remember from that era, and we don't remember them for what evil capitalist bastards they were, and their business practices are awful. You know, much of what they did you couldn't get away with anymore because it's illegal, and certainly was at that time not perhaps illegal but definitely immoral. Mackey never had that problem, and he gave away immense sums charitably, he and his wife did, almost always anonymously. He just didn't like personal attention. But if you go to New York, the original donation for the Metropolitan Opera is anonymous. That's the Mackeys. The same one for here in San Francisco, the opera there, the big original donation of the building is the Mackeys, but that's anonymous. The cathedral in Sacramento for Patrick Minogue, the priest from the Comstock Lode who became the first bishop in the Sacramento Archdiocese, well, the Mackeys built that cathedral for him, and just on and on and on. And when he died, you know, his obituary was on the front page of almost every American newspaper and many in Europe and all over the world, all saying it, he's one of the most widely admired Americans. But he's almost forgotten today outside of this particular part of the country. So once I sort of fell in love with him, I suppose, or fell in love with his story, I really wanted to write a book that might rescue him from obscurity, because his story is absolutely remarkable. Came to this country as a young boy with his family when he was 9 years old. They settled in the Five Points neighborhood of New York. That's the Gangs of New York neighborhood. They must have been doing pretty well, because Mackey actually went to school for 2 years between the age of 9 and the age of 11, and only about 50% of the school-aged Irish children attended any school at all in New York City at that time. You know, the Irish were horribly discriminated against. You know, they were unwanted foreign scum who were bringing crime and disease and drugs to our country, and you know, would never amount to anything except this scourge on good Yankee Protestant society. You know, that fell apart for the Mackey family 2 years later when his father died. So he went to work selling newspapers, shining shoes, sweeping street crossings, carrying packages for tips. Got a job in a shipyard as an apprentice when he was 16. Held that job through the gold discovery. He's not a 49er. I think probably because he'd promised his service to his employer in New York through the term of his apprenticeship, which typically ran 4 or 5 years. But when that was up, he came to California when he was 21 years old in the fall of 1851, and then mined through the 1850s around Downeyville. Probably finding enough gold to support himself and his mother and sister back in New York. That was one of the things that was very surprising to me about researching this story. I thought when you came to California in the gold rush that it was a one-way trip and you were never going back. You know, it was a 4-month walk from Missouri to get out here. But I was astonished to discover how much people went back. You know, within a year or two of the gold discovery, you could get back to New York in 24 days. You would take a boat down to Panama, cross the isthmus, and then take a boat up to New York. And it was totally routine. People did it all the time. You would go home, hang out with your family for a couple months, and then come back to California. So that very much surprised me. And indeed, how much these 19th century folks got around surprised me a lot as well. And the business network that grew up around, this new, American civilization springing up on the coast. There was a big gap of nothing between the Missouri River and California in the 1850s, with the only significant, Caucasian settlement was the stuff in Utah with the Mormons settling around Salt Lake. And they were very hostile to the United States government at that time, and quite rightly so. They'd been murdered and driven out of Illinois and Missouri, and they were looking for a place where they didn't have to deal with the United States government, and picked Utah. And then you have California. Well, Mackey's out there and he mines, probably doing well and going broke and doing well again. That was real typical for the California experience, but was broke by the end of the 1850s because of the declining returns. Right? Those guys were good at what they did. That was another really big lesson to me out of this whole story was, wow, these guys really were industrious. They worked hard and they were good at what they did. They got the easy to find gold out of the California stream beds quickly. And so late in the 1850s, they were having a hard time making grub, as miners call it, right? If you're on a claim where you're finding enough gold to buy your provisions, that's making grub, right? And any money that claim will pay above that is a wage. So a claim that paid wages was a good claim. That meant you could support yourself and make a little extra money. But they had fallen under that threshold by the end of the 1850s, he and his partner, and were not making grub. So when news shot through the Sierra foothills of this strange new metal discovery over the Sierras in the Washoe diggings that seemed to be gold and silver twinned together in an ore that had never been found in the West up till that point, Mackey pulled up stakes and walked from from Downeyville to Virginia City, because he and his partner were too poor to afford a mule, and walked onto the Comstock, what would become known as the Comstock Lode, or was just being become known as the Comstock Lode, in maybe July or early August of 1859. And he didn't have a penny, so he went to work for $4 a day in somebody else's mine. And Mackey got his start by not only working one shift of hard labor per day, but also working a second shift in exchange for feet. Now that's how those claims were owned, because it's quartz mining on the Comstock Lode, not placer mining. Placer mining being California style in the stream beds, where you own like a rectangle of dirt. In a good paying placer, it could be 10 feet square, and you would mine that. You wouldn't own it. You would have the right to mine it, and then you didn't want to own it. Actually, miners desperately didn't want to own it for fear that they'd be forced to pay taxes on it. They wanted to be able to dig it and then leave it, which the whole legal structure allowed them to do. Well, the Comstock lode is different. Quartz mining, where you have gold and silver infused into a quartz vein in an ore, that's not on the surface. It's hanging like a sheet in the earth. You have country rock on both sides of the vein, which is typically a fault zone that hot water has circled up into from below and deposited the minerals in there. And in some places they're very highly concentrated with gold and silver, and in other places not concentrated at all. So you have a very uneven distribution in the vein, which is critical to how things develop. But those claims are owned as feet on the line of the lode. So there's no expectation of value anything that isn't in this crack. It's a long line hanging in the ground. So you own a slice of it and you're allowed to follow it wherever it goes underground. So the claims were owned by feet. If you owned 200 feet of the Comstock lode, that was your claim, 200 feet. And because it's very expensive, that kind of mining does not pay a wage like placer mining does. Small miners much prefer placer mining because you get a return every day. Quartz mining, you have to dig down, you have to dig out the ore, and you can get this very rich ore. And the best Comstock lode ore was worth about $3,000 to the ton. But you still have to get the gold and silver out of this black rock. You don't find it as gold and silver. So you have to process it, you have to mill it, that's called milling. And all that's very expensive to do. And so the payoff is long run, which means you need money, you need financial support. So people would sell feet of their claim. If you had a 200-foot claim or a 400-foot claim, you'd have 400 shares, 400 feet of that, and you could sell them like stock. And, huge stock frenzies or frenzies in buying and selling feet sprung up. And, none of you attractive young ladies in the room in the 1860s would have entertained a proposition from a gentleman who wasn't at least a centipede and hopefully a millipede. Mackey worked his second shift in exchange for feet. If an owner didn't have ore at the surface, he didn't have a cash flow, he had the potential of a cash flow or the potential value in his mind, he would trade feet for labor. And so Mackey did that, and through the first winter on the Comstock lode, he dug an adit for the Union mine and got paid in a share of the mine's ownership. And he always speculated in mines, and because he spent his entire working life underground, he generally speculated pretty well. You should not speculate in mining as a civilian against miners, because they know what's going on and you don't. They will kill you. That was as true in 1860 as it is today. But Mackey, working underground, speculated pretty wisely, worked hard. People recognized his capacity for leadership and his unbelievable work ethic. Everybody that knew Mackey talked about how hard he worked. And he accumulated a lot of feet in a variety of different mines through the early 1860s, became a timberman, and then a gang boss underground, and then a shift leader, and a foreman, or an underground foreman, and then a mine foreman, and then a superintendent in pretty quick succession. And in 1865, he sold everything that he owned and used that money to buy the majority ownership of the Kentuck mine. Now, you guys are locals. You got the Gold Hill Hotel up there in Gold Hill. Right out the back door, you have that mine shaft. That's the south shaft of the Yellow Jacket. Just south of that is the Kentuck mine. The Kentuck mine is one of the smallest mines on the Kentuck lode. It's only 94 feet wide. And Mackey spent every penny that he had and that he could borrow digging a mine shaft or a shaft down there to try and find ore. And he borrowed $20,000 from a guy named James Phelan. Now, if you guys are familiar with San Francisco, the Phelan building on Market Street was put up by James Phelan's son. So there are strong connections to this even today. James Phelan loaned him $20,000. Now, $20,000 in coin was huge in California at the time, and Nevada. I'm including you in that, I suppose, on the Pacific slope, as they would have said. The terms of the loan were, the loans ran 3 months, and the interest was 3% per month interest. So that means that the guy that had loaned the money, so James Phelan, who'd loaned Mackey 20 grand, could call the loan after 3 months. And if Mackey could not pay the 20 grand back, he would lose his collateral property, which in this case, the only thing of any value he has is the stock in this mine, the ownership of this mine. And so he spends 3 months, or most of 3 months, digging this shaft down to 250 feet below a horse whim, with a horse winding around to Capstan, taking the things up there. They get the shaft down to 250 feet, and they have not found any ore. So they don't have a cash flow and have no chance of paying this loan back should Phelan call the loan. Worse, the Crown Point mine, which is immediately south of the Kentuck, about 40 feet deeper, strikes ore pretty close to the Kentuck line, within about 60 feet of the Kentuck line. It's a really good strike. And miners, you think that it's possible that this ore body will spread into the Kentuck mine. And if that ore body does spread into the Kentuck mine, the mine is worth a lot more than $20,000. So if Phelan has been paying attention to what's going on at the south end of the lode, he will call Mackey's loan, take the stock, and then, mine down a few more feet, find the ore body, and it'll be his, not John Mackey's. Mackey will be broke. So Mackey goes into this negotiation having no leverage, slams his fist down, says, "Sir, 3% interest per month is outrageous. I demand that you reduce the rate." And Phelan looks at him and says, "Young man, if you know what's good for you, you'll accept an extension at 3% and say nothing about the interest." Which is, of course, exactly what Mackey wanted. So he protests and hems and haws, but eventually relents and signs the extension. And a few weeks later, right at the end of 1865, they struck ore at 278 feet in the Kentuck shaft. And the ore body did indeed span the entire width of that mine. And over the next 18 months, Mackey and his partner took $1.6 million worth of gold and silver out of that mine. And that set Mackey on the road to greater success. He ended up with about $600,000 in profit from that, which is a stunning sum of money in the context of 1865. His partner, a guy named J.M. Walker, decides that's enough. 600 grand will last him for the rest of his life. So they dissolve their partnership. He goes east. Walker goes east, where he's got a brother touting spectacular opportunities in railroad investments. Mackey and promptly goes broke. By the way, by the middle 1870s, Walker was back in San Francisco as a stockbroker, and he died destitute in the early 1890s. Mackey takes his 600 grand, divides it into 3 parts, invests in 2 other mines which fail, but the third venture, the Hale and Norcross mine, which is right up there about where the Fourth Ward School sits in Virginia City, that pays off. And now he's in partnership with, he forms a secret partnership actually to steal the Hale and Norcross mine, or to spirit the Hale and Norcross mine out from under the bank ring. And the bank ring were the San Francisco capitalists that monopolized the best mines in the lode and had a very sophisticated vertical monopoly on mines. Now, I did not appreciate this before I started researching this book, but there's many, many ways to make money out of a mine that don't involve finding gold and silver in it. You can really work a mine. Particularly a publicly traded mine in an era without corporate governance regulations. So the bank ring guys have, through control of the proxy votes, few banks would loan money on mine stock collateral. The Bank of California, however, fronted by William Sharon in Virginia City, would. But if they were going to loan money on your collateral mine stock, they insisted on receiving the proxy to vote that stock in the mine's elections. And since many people wanted to borrow money on their existing stock and use it in other mining stock speculations, they insisted on receiving the proxy vote for those stocks too. So the Bank of California quickly accumulates power in the management of mines. As soon as they get 51% of the proxies, they boot out the superintendent and install their own guy. Ostensibly because to streamline management and improve efficiency and redundant effort and stuff like that. However, while that's going on, they have also been loaning money on mills, typically around Empire, out the Carson River, which has the benefit of free power from the river. So the bank has also captured these reduction mills, the things that stamp and process the ore. Now, mills make money based per ton of ore that they reduce. They don't keep the returns. The returns from that ore go to the mine, go to the stockholders of the mine. Now, when they've captured like 5 or 6 reduction mills, now these are owned by the Bank of California, which is a publicly owned company. So we, the public, own the Bank of California, but they're the directors. They sell these mills to a company called the Union Mill and Mining Company that they personally own. Sharon Ralston and Darius Ogden, William Ralston and Darius Ogden. So they've sold these mills at bank cost, by the way, which they acquired for the sacrifice of very small loans to themselves. And now they get the mines whose superintendents they control to start sending ore to their mills. And since their mills earn money per ton of ore reduced, that's a pretty regular cash flow as long as there's rock coming down to them. And it was about $20 per ton to reduce ore. That breaks a whole other host of possibilities for making money because, the average eye can't tell the difference between $90 rock or $60 rock and $10 rock. Now, if there's $10 worth of gold and silver in a ton of ore, that isn't actually ore, that is waste, because it costs $20 to reduce it, and you only get $10 out of it. So, you're losing $10 in that transaction. Whereas, let's say we have $90 ore. That's a ton of ore with $90 worth of gold and silver in it. And by the way, if we own a mine that has a lot of $90 ore in it, we are going to make a lot of money. And we're really happy about that, we think. So that $90 rock goes to the mill crushes it up and processes it, and you lose about 30% in the reduction process, or 35%. So you get, say, in round figures from that $90 rock, you get $60 worth of gold and silver out of that, $20 of which pays the milling charge, and then $40 goes back to the stockholders of the mine. Great, that's profit. We're pleased with that. However, since it's not so easy to tell the difference between $10 rock and $90 rock, if you cut 1 ton of $90 rock, if you add 2 tons of $10 rock to it, it changes the economics of this transaction entirely. You get about $70 worth of gold and silver from those 3 tons, of which $60 pays the mill because it's reduced from 3 tons of ore, and $10 goes back to the stockholders of the mine. And the mining stockholders, us, the general public, doesn't actually know that we're being robbed. And Sharon, Darius Ogden Mills, and William Ralston became the richest men on the Pacific Coast running that scam through the late 1860s. Their vulnerability is that they don't actually own the stock. They only have the proxy votes for that. And there is a huge stock market trading mine stocks that has sprung up on Montgomery Street in San Francisco. The trading nexus, 600 Montgomery Street, is the exact site of the Transamerica Pyramid. And so Mackey gets in a partnership. He's the money, and he joins in partnership with James Fair, who is another expert miner, and 2 Irish saloon keepers turned stockbrokers named James Flood and William O'Brien, who happen to have a saloon, the Auction Lunch Saloon, right around the corner from 600 Montgomery Street. So they are hearing through the early 1860s, they were hearing great stock tips over the bar top, and they actually started acting on them. And James Flood turns out to be a good stock market operator, so they make some money. And they form a secret partnership with Mackey, who's got all this money, and they launch a hostile raid on the Hale and Norcross mine. And in late 1868 and early 1869, you can see lots of Hale and Norcross shares changing hands, James Flood buying and selling lots of shares, because he's now a stockbroker primarily, but nobody notices him buying a lot more than he's selling. And when the mine's next election comes around, they have the majority stock. So they boot out the bank rings management and install themselves as managers of the Hale and Norcross mine. And because they are stockholders, like the rest of us, their interests are aligned with the other stockholders, and they start running the mine for profit and do very well out of this mine. It was a very good bonanza, not a world-changing one, but because they're miners, around that time or a little bit after that time, the bank ring makes a colossal strike in the Crown Point and the Belcher mine, just south of the Gold Hill Hotel. Proves to be the biggest find ever made on the Pacific coast. They pull like $60 million worth of gold and silver out of that ore body. Incredible sum of money. Or $45 million, I think, somewhere in there. So they've vaulted way up here, and there's another ownership group. And so Mackey and his guys are in here in distant third place. If they're going to compete for control of the Comstock lode, which is, the Silicon Valley of the 1860s and 1870s, and that is the perfect analogy for what an absolute important powerhouse the Comstock lode and Nevada was in the Pacific Coast economy. The same interest that we put in happenings in the tech companies today is exactly the interest that San Franciscans and Californians and Nevadans put in the Comstock mines at that time. It was huge in the economy of the era. Anyway, if Mackey and his crowd are going to compete for ownership or for control of the Comstock, they need a bigger find. So they invest their raise from the Hale and Norcross in a neglected part of the lode, right in the middle of town, the Consolidated Virginia mine in what becomes the California mine. So if you're sitting up there in the bucket of blood day drinking, your ass is directly over what in the middle 1870s was the richest spot in the world. And it wasn't close. Anyway, because these mining ventures are hugely financially risky, they invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in developing the mine. They take it down. They dig a big, long drift over from the Golden Curry at 1,167 feet. And about, out on the 1,167 foot level, they just nick the top of ore, and it's not where they expect to find it. They actually aren't in the Comstock lode proper at that point. They're a little east of it, and they don't really know what they've found. They expect the ore to be west in the proper Comstock lode, but they've hit something that's trending east, and it's just barely profitable, like $22 of ore. $22 ore, but ore is where you find it, is one of the oldest saws in mining, so they follow this ore body and develop it down level by level over the course of the next 2 years, and they're pretty much prospecting in a 100-foot grid, so they would winze down, that's like digging a shaft underground 100 feet, and then drift out and cross-cut, so they were dividing this whole ore body up into grids, so they have an idea of what they've got, and wow, it keeps getting bigger and better as they go down. And when they hit the 1,500-foot level, so that they've taken it down from 1,100 feet all the way to 1,500 feet, they realize that they've found something that's going to make them the richest people in the world. The ore body at its biggest is about 1,000 feet long. It's up to 350 feet wide and 600 feet deep, and it's worth an average of about $100 to the ton. And in early December of 1874, they do something that had never been done in Comstock lode mining. They threw the mine open to anybody's inspection and let all the journalists and any investor who wanted to go down there descend to the 1,500-foot level and look at what they'd found. And people were astonished at the quantity of ore there. And it's obvious, Mackey knows at this point that what he's got is going to make him one of the richest people in the world. And in the late 1870s, his monthly cash income was well in excess of $450,000 per month, which is like a lot of money in today's dollars. None of us are going to turn our noses up at that, right? But in the context of the 1870s, it's vastly more money. So how much is that? They ended up taking $110 million of gold and silver out of that ore body over the course of the next 4 years. It drove Virginia City to the biggest boom that it would ever have, and let's talk about that. Virginia City in 1876, at the height of the boom, the best month of mining on the Comstock lode is June of 1876. That's the same month that Custer gets rubbed out on the Little Bighorn, right? they pull this money out, and $110 million in the context of today's money is worth about 204 billion modern dollars as an equal share of the total national economy. Comstock Lode, in its 20-year heydays in the 60s and 1870s, raised about $330 million. That would be the equivalent of about 600 billion modern dollars. So you can understand the frenzy, right? That $100 million doesn't have that big of an emotional impact to us anymore, but 600 billion, my God, that's some money. Mackey, Mackey wanted to run, his ambition was to run a large and successful mining operation. He didn't really have that much of an ambition with what to do with the money. His wife, however, she knew exactly what to do with the money. She's got a rags to riches story that's every bit as amazing as his own, and I think she's been much maligned historically, particularly by Western Nevadans. She grew up in Downeyville, although Mackey and her don't seem to have known each other in the 1850s. She married a promising young doctor named Edmund Bryant a few days after her 16th birthday in 1860. She quickly had a daughter and then another daughter who died very young of a septic sore throat, which I take to be like a really bad strep infection of the throat. The ways to die in the 19th century is unbelievable. The larger problem was that the doctor had developed a powerful thirst. And squandered most of their money in ill-fated mining speculations. It's just as easy, actually it's way easier to lose money in mining speculations than it is to make money. And he also got himself addicted to one of the only useful medications he had, which was opium and morphine. So he's dissipating pretty bad, and he leaves Virginia City to go to Austin to try and rebuild his fortunes, and essentially abandons Louise on the Comstock Lode. She's got to support herself doing sewing for the town's fancy ladies. Now, plain sewing, which isn't so plain, when I read the details of what that entails, a woman's got to know like 25 different stitches and be fast at it and all kinds of things. But since it was a part of every woman's domestic education, there was no premium on the wages. Every woman knew how to do it. So it was the lowest paid job in the needle trades, was being a seamstress, a plain sewer. Anyway, she ekes out a living doing that. When the doctor comes back from Austin, he's even more dissipated than when he left. And by the way, a doctor in the 19th century is not a prestigious occupation. You could just hang out a shingle and say you were a doctor. Although this guy had some training, apparently. He'd gone to Columbia. Good question. And, Louise is earning the money now, and so their surviving daughter is left in his care while she is out sewing one day, and the daughter falls down the stairs and breaks her pelvis, which is suspiciously like being helped by the alcoholic, enraged father, and is a crippled. The doctor leaves the Lode in disgrace, turns up in San Francisco, disappears, turns up near Downeyville with a case of tetanus. I surmise likely from injecting himself with an infected needle, because doctors were using morphine injections at this time, and he dies. And so she is now a widow on the Comstock Lode in 1866. She meets Mackey after his Kentuck mine success, and he's about 15 years older than her, when he is a man on the way up, but not the richest man in the world. She's pretty well educated, actually. Her mother could speak French and Italian, so she spoke both those languages fluently, and had some, education, but Mackey didn't, so she was a little reluctant to marry this uncouth miner, but eventually relented and did, and they seem, by all accounts, to have had a pretty famous marriage. When they make the big Bonanza, and she moves to San Francisco in the early 1870s, when they have two sons together, educational opportunities. She does not like Virginia City, the dirt, the grit, the noise, the drunkenness, the drugs, the violence. She wants to a better place. Well, She goes to San Francisco. They take a house at Polk Street and Farrell, I believe, which isn't a great neighborhood now, but then was like an up and coming neighborhood. But she didn't really like San Francisco either. It's still pretty dirty, an adolescent town. We're talking 1870, 71 now. And in 1872, they take a trip, a European vacation, and Paris really does do it for her. So when they hit the Big Bonanza, that's what that big ore body was called. People started calling it the Big Bonanza. When they hit that, Mackie buys for her 9 Rue de Tilsit in Paris. Now, if you've ever stood on the Arc de Triomphe, you have that little circular park around you, the Place de l'Étoile, and there's the front ring of mansions around that. Well, 9 Rue de Tilsit is one of those mansions. It's currently the Belgian embassy. So it is quite literally the best address in Paris. That she's set up there, Mackie puts $10 million on bonds on deposit for her in Paris. So she's got this astonishing monthly income, like larger than several European countries. And she is very charitable in Paris, always the first to support the arts and the charities and whatnot, but also throwing these lavish parties that were totally famous. And because she was such a good linguist, she quickly got involved with the European aristocracy, and she was the first American woman widely accepted in continental society. So she's like the Paris Hilton of the 1870s and 1880s. And she becomes like what I think you can make a great claim that Louise Mackie, because her social conquests were coming back across the Atlantic on the transatlantic telegraph cable and were filling the society columns of American newspapers. Mackie bought her an emerald, or rather a sapphire the size of a pigeon's egg, 157 carat flawless sapphire. It had been owned by a Russian princess, had it made into this beautiful sapphire and diamond necklace that's very famous in the history of art jewelry. It's made by a Parisian jeweler named Boucheron. And if you go to Boucheron's website, you'll still see Louise Mackie lauded as the best client they've had in history. So she's over there doing her thing, and all these social conquests, she's a Catholic girl made good, right? Filling the society columns of American newspapers because of the transatlantic telegraph cable. So you can make a great case. What is the transatlantic telegraph cable but the first digital communications device, intercontinental? So she's like the world's first social media celebrity. Mackie is staying most of the time in the late 1870s in Virginia City, because taking this ore body out of the ground is a very difficult engineering process, and he is unwilling to take his eye off of it, right? So he would work 9 months of the year, and then he would go visit his family in Europe. It was only 8 days to New York on the Transcontinental Railroad, and then only another 14 days to Europe on a steamship. So he would go hang out with his family for like 2 months and then come home. And after the Big Bonanza was out of the ground, he sort of switched his years around so that he would spend like 9 months in Europe with his family and then 3 or 4 months on the Comstock lode and in the West tending to his business interests, because they expanded to other mining regions and to San Francisco and stuff like that. And in 1883, and they are famous, they are world famous, the Mackies. Now, every person knew their story as this unbelievable rags to riches. Mackie had been born on a dirt floor in Ireland. He had shared the floor with the family pig as a young boy, and now he is the richest person in the world. And he was invited by the American president, I believe it's Chester Arthur, in 1883, to go serve as the unofficial official ambassador of the United States at the coronation of the Russian Tsar. So this is this splendidly barbaric ceremony in the Kremlin, the climax of which is Tsar Nicholas III, raising the crown up and whacking it on his own head. And Mackie is there with his wife as the official ambassadors of the United States, and they were the most interesting people there. All of the cream of European aristocracy is there, but every European newspaper wants to talk to the Mackies and hear what they have to say. And, the Tsar talked to Mackie at the ball, and the Tsarina was grilling him about conditions in California, and he said that Louise Mackie was the best dressed woman at the ball, and the European newspapers couldn't get over the fact that she had an entire Pullman carriage behind there. So they had the Pullman carriage that they were traveling in. There was one behind that only for her dresses. Mackie gets involved, like I said earlier, in the transatlantic telegraph wars. He's one of the few people in the world that could lay a rival cable. So in 1883, he's essentially been retired for 3 years. They've been traveling Europe, seeing the great art and the great music in the world. And they both became huge patrons of artists in France and in Europe at the time. There was a party that they attended in southern France where somebody had brought the entire Vienna Orchestra, led by Johann Sebastian Strauss, who was the greatest waltz composer in the world. They brought the entire orchestra to play at this party in the south of France. Just super lavish stuff. But Mackie, never lost his common touch. He what's the quote? Let me see if I can fish it up right. In company, he was always polite, and no one ever heard him say an unkind word about any woman of any station. But about the male European aristocracy, he was profanely contemptuous, right? He thought that they were all parasites and bummers and ought to have gone to work like he did. He never lost his common touch. He always, never lorded it over the miners. He'd come back to Virginia City and he'd get on the cage and drop down to the 1,600-foot level of the mines the next day and be, inspecting what was going on down there. And never lost his common touch, and was extremely popular with the guys that he'd worked with. Think about it. He'd come up through their ranks. He was living proof that there was no uncrossable chasm that, divided a $4 a day miner from a guy worth $50 million. And so he was sort of a living embodiment of the American dream in the 19th century, and never lost, never compromised his integrity in business dealings. And there's all kinds of quotes to that effect in the newspapers in the 1880s and 1890s, which I just thought was very fascinating. So that's my quick summary, or maybe not so quick, of the Mackie story in the Bonanza King. I'm delighted to entertain anybody's questions, should anybody have them. Sir?
I understand there's an interesting story about his self-education.
Yeah, well, Mackie wasn't, the question is about Mackie's self-education. He always pursued learning. He really felt his lack of a formal education. And let me see if I can, it's not Alf Doughton, it's one of the other writers. They all wrote memoirs up there, but talked about coming across, having to go call on Mackie for some reason at his quarters late one night, when everybody on the Comstock load is out boozing, and Mackie was in there studying a common grammar book, trying to improve himself, and studying mathematics or grammar or whatever. So yeah, he definitely, and he very much, I think that's why Mackie was very willing to have his wife move to Paris, because of the educational opportunities for their sons. They were of school age then, and he certainly wanted his sons to have the educational opportunities that he had missed. Where Comstockers and Nevadans would take Louise to task for taking Mackie away. He was like the saint of Virginia City, taking him away from them. I think he was pretty willing to have that arrangement exist because he thought it would be best for his sons. Ma'am?
I have one question over here. We all talk about the Comstock load and everything else. How did it get to be called the Comstock load? Did you run across that anywhere?
Yes, the question is, how did the Comstock load get its name? Well, Henry Comstock was one of the guys on the Washoe diggings. Now, it was a placer mining region through the 1850s, so Gold Canyon had placer gold in it, which the guys dug up. But the main ore bodies of the Comstock lode, the one that was in Gold Hill and the one at the Ophir mine, were just a few feet underground. They were found in April and June of 1859. Henry Comstock horned his way into, he wasn't one of the guys that found it, but he horned his way into the original company of McLaughlin and O'Reilly, who the two Irishmen who did find it, and through nefarious means, but they admitted him to the partnership. And what Comstock was a good salesman, and they all wanted to sell out early on. When you're a placer miner and you find a quartz mine, you often want to sell it because it's so expensive and complicated to develop, and you don't know what's down there. Yeah, you have great ore at the surface, but you don't know what's underground. You can't see into the ground, and they couldn't see into the ground any more than we can. So they wanted to sell, and Comstock was a loudmouth who touted the value of this claim, and surely it's the greatest mine ever discovered in the West. And so they all sold out in the first season, but Comstock's name, Comstock's mine, Comstock's vein, Comstock's lode became the Comstock lode. And he's like the antithesis of John Mackey. He's a very interesting character. He had money in 1859 when Mackey doesn't have a nickel, and you can chart his descent through the 1860s, and that's pretty darn interesting because he was such a famous name, but he squandered his money. He tried to open a hardware store in Silver City, thinking that Silver City would rise up as the great mining center of the region. It doesn't. He was kind of an open-handed guy, so he extended credit to lots of unworthy friends who never paid him back. Within a couple of years, he was mining, again, placer mining, so washing gravel for a living in eastern Oregon. And news from him would come back to the newspapers, and you can chart him. He mines in the Burnt River Basin in Oregon. Then he's one of the first guys into the South Boise Basin around Boise, Idaho. And then he's in Montana on Flint Creek. And then he turns up in the late 1860s at a place called the Sweet River Mines at South Pass, Wyoming. South Pass City is a ghost town there now on the site, but that's from a later mining boom. Anyway, he joins that. There's a big rush there. It's a mushroom town. It lasts about a year and then disappears on that boom. And he joins the Bighorn River Exploring and Prospecting Expedition, which is supposedly to explore the Black Hills, the Powder River Basin, and the Bighorn Mountains. This is the early 1870s, 1869, 1870. A white person couldn't set foot in the Powder River Basin and hope to keep their hair at that time. And it had been, the United States had lost the Red Cloud War 2 years before, so we had ceded that to the Indians. That was unclaimed Indian territory owned by the Arapahoes and the Shoshones and the Crows and the Sioux. And you had to have permission from the tribes to cross in there. They certainly weren't giving it to a prospecting expedition. Anyway, if they'd have managed to prospect the Black Hills, they'd have had a completely different outcome, but they can't get to the Black Hills, so they prospect up the western slope of the Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming, which is one of the few places in the West that doesn't have a scrap of mineral wealth in it. He turns up about 6 months later in Bozeman, Montana, dead broke, destitute of prospects. And think about it, he's Henry Comstock. At that time, $100 million had come out of the Comstock lode in the 1860s that bears his name. He must have seen it in 1,000 eyes around 1,000 campfires, right? Like, dude, you blew the biggest chance in the West. And so in September of 1870, he clenched the barrel of a Navy revolver between his teeth and blew his brains out. And he didn't actually live to see the heydays of the Comstock lode in the 1870s. So. Sir?
How long did he live and what happened to his estate?
Mackey died in 1902 in London. And his estate, his eldest son, John Mackey Jr., had been tragically killed in a horse riding accident in 1895, which ruined the last 7 years of Mackey's life. He was never the same after that. So he was running a profitable international telegraph business at that time, the Commercial Cable Company, and a smaller domestic one called the Postal Telegraph that was a minor rival to the Western Union, but with a reciprocal agreement. And he had just started trying to lay the Trans-Pacific cable because, the U.S. had just taken over the Philippines at that time. And so we were going to he wanted to help the country by laying a cable to our new colonial possessions in Hawaii and the Philippines. And he had undertaken that, which his second eldest son, Clarence, completed. Later on in the commercial cable company stayed managed by his son Clarence through the 20s. In 1928, he merged with a multinational communications conglomerate called ITT in a stock exchange that he must have felt really great about when the stock value went from like 150 to 450 in between 1928 and 1929, and probably not so good about by 1932 when it was trading at about $2 a share. IT&T survived the Second World War, the Great Depression and the Second World War. It had business interests on both sides of the war. It's one of the first multinational conglomerates. It's a remarkably evil company with hands in many South American coups in the 60s. But it spun off its communications arm to private equity in the early 60s. So Mackey Communications still exists. It is one of the dominant players in the maritime communications industry. So if the merchant ships around the world, they are filled with electronics gear on their bridges, navigations, radars, communication stuff. Lots of that stuff is made by Mackey Communications, and they have offices all over the world. And when this book came out, I got a call from their CEO, and he's like, "Did you know?" And I'm like, "No, I did not. I wish I did." And so I had lunch with him when he was out here, actually on vacation, because he's got a tighter radar. So.
One of Mackey's granddaughters
Yes.
married Irving Berlin.
That's right, and that was actually.
He wrote about 1,800 or 2,200 songs. He wrote 3 songs to her. And another one, I think, married the lawyer that did her divorce. I think his name was Hawkins. And if you check with KNPV, the local public TV station,
Yeah.
Hawkins is a major
Oh.
contributor.
Yeah, well, the Irving Berlin story is interesting. So all of his love songs, they had a famously successful marriage too, Ellen Mackey and Irving Berlin. She's also, before they married, she wrote an exceptionally influential article in the early history of a magazine called The New Yorker. It's credited with establishing The New Yorker's first-person informal style. So when you read a New Yorker's nonfiction article, the writer is always a part of that story, right? You are always traveling around with that writer, sort of seeing the story unfold through the writer's eyes. That's the first-person informal style, but that was developed by Ellen Mackey. And then, of course, Irving Berlin's love songs are all inspired by her. So you listen to Blue Skies by Willie Nelson. Well, that's an Irving Berlin song that went to a #1, right? And that's Ellen Mackey's Blue Eyes that you're listening to an homage to, and on and on. So
And right, Clarence Mackey then donated to the University.
That's right. The Mackey School of Mines is a Clarence Mackey endowment from 1907. So it's not directly donated by John Mackey, but it is that, the mining wealth there. Mackey Stadium, the whole ball of wax up there is originally endowed by the Mackey family. Are there any other questions?
Well, thank you very much.
My pleasure.